The sun illuminated the central square of Verona, and the long shadows of Renaissance buildings stretched over the worn cobblestones, like silent witnesses to centuries of love stories. It was there, amidst the bustle of tourists and the timeless stillness of the city, that Elizabeth first saw him. Richard, with his dark hair and reserved smile, seemed out of place in the modern chaos, as if he belonged to a simpler era, where promises were sealed forever. Elizabeth, a young woman with a dreamy soul, felt her heart race. Something inside her, a quiet premonition, told her that this moment would change her life forever. Richard, on the other hand, had noticed Elizabeth before their eyes met. He had been watching her from afar, enchanted by the grace with which she moved, almost floating through the narrow streets of the city. In that instant, something inside him, a feeling of inexplicable belonging, compelled him to approach. When he finally got close enough to see the details of her face, Richard knew he was standing before someone he would not soon forget. Youth brought promises, and in Verona anything seemed possible, even the kind of love that shapes entire lives. For weeks, they encountered each other by chance in the same squares and alleyways, as if destiny was intertwining their paths before they even realized what was happening. It was as if Verona itself was bringing them together, an ideal setting for two young hearts to fall in love. During the moments they spent together, words were few, but the connection between them was deep, almost palpable. The days passed too quickly, and Elizabeth found herself eagerly awaiting their next meeting, while Richard, though more reserved, found himself waiting for her at the corners that now seemed familiar. The city seemed to conspire in their favor, wrapped in an aura of romance that blinded them to anything else. In the afternoons they spent together, wandering aimlessly, Richard absorbed every detail of Elizabeth, from the way she laughed softly to the sparkle in her eyes when she spoke of her dreams. There was an intensity in everything they shared, as if they were living each moment to the fullest, aware that perhaps life would take them down unexpected paths. Verona wasn't just the backdrop. It was the invisible thread that kept them united, even if only for a brief summer. One golden afternoon by the Adige River, Elizabeth looked at Richard with a mix of curiosity and emotion. The wind ruffled his hair, and she wondered what the future held for them. Though they were young, there was a depth to their feelings that both scared and thrilled her. She knew somehow that this love would be special, unique, but also in her heart there was a small shadow of doubt. After all, could love survive the uncertainties of the future? The warm days of the Italian summer began to give way to cooler breezes, and the rhythm of life around them seemed to slow down. The impending goodbye hung over them, though neither had the courage to mention it. Elizabeth clung to the present, while Richard, in his silence, knew that soon he would have to make a decision that would change everything. Their time together seemed to slip through their fingers like sand, and they were both caught in a bubble of euphoria and fear. Youth, with its promises and uncertainties, made them feel invincible, yet vulnerable to what was to come. On the last night they spent in Verona, Richard held Elizabeth's hand longer than usual. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, hidden desires, and dreams that might never come true. Elizabeth, in her heart, knew she was about to lose something she had never felt before, and a silent tear rolled down her cheek. Richard wiped it away with the tenderness of someone who understood the depth of that gesture. The sound of trains was constant at the Verona station as Richard left, carrying with him the silent promises and shared dreams with Elizabeth. He was heading to Munich, where a military career awaited him, but with each mile that took him further from Verona, he felt as though a part of himself remained behind. Elizabeth, on the other hand, watched the train disappear on the horizon, trying to etch every detail of that farewell into her memory. Tears silently streamed down her face, mixing with the cool morning breeze, as she wondered if that goodbye would be their last. The weeks that followed were filled with letters, each one laden with promises of eternal love, memories of the moments they had shared, and hope for an uncertain future. Elizabeth read Richard's letters with growing eagerness, as if each word was a way to keep him close, despite the distance. Her own letters were equally full of emotion, telling him about the empty days in Verona and the thoughts that haunted her at night when only silence filled the air. However, with each new letter, something subtle began to change. Richard was immersed in his new reality in Germany, and the demands of military life began to take a toll. The missions, the training, and the growing distance between him and Elizabeth made everything harder. The responses took longer to arrive, and when they did, there was a different tone in them, darker. Richard felt torn between two worlds, the duty to serve his country and the desire to be with the woman he loved. With each new letter he sent, he felt more guilty for not being able to be with her. Elizabeth, on the other hand, tried to keep hope alive. For her, each letter was a promise that their love would survive, no matter the time or distance. However, as the months passed, the silence between Richard's letters became longer and more painful. She began to fear what she had been trying to ignore, that perhaps, despite all the love they felt, the distance and time were slowly pulling them apart. Still, she continued to write, her words filled with love, hope, and a growing sense of fear. One day, a letter from Richard arrived that was different. He spoke of the difficulties he was facing, of how military life was consuming him. He confessed that the future they had dreamed of together seemed more distant with each passing day, and that perhaps it was time to accept that they couldn't continue this way. Elizabeth read those words with a heavy heart, feeling as though the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. This was the moment she had feared the most, the end of a dream she had believed would last forever. Devastated, Elizabeth responded to the letter with passion, pleading with him not to give up on them, on everything they had built together. But Richard's response was final. He believed he couldn't give her the future she deserved, that the love they felt was real, but the reality of military life was an insurmountable barrier. Elizabeth was left shattered, holding in her hands the letter that sealed the end of what she had considered the love of her life. The letters stopped. Silence now reigned, leaving Elizabeth with memories of a time that would never return. Each morning she woke with the weight of an emptiness, trying in vain to fill the void that Richard had left in her heart. The love that had once been her greatest strength now seemed to be the source of her deepest pain. The years passed like a fog, enveloping Elizabeth in a life she had never imagined for herself. Verona, once a city filled with promises and memories of love, now served as the backdrop for a common life. She married a kind man, someone who filled the void Richard had left as best he could, but never with the same intensity as that youthful love. The marriage brought children and responsibilities, and over time, Elizabeth learned to leave Richard in the past, buried in a part of her memory where dreams no longer reached. However, there were moments amidst the routine of the days when Elizabeth felt Richard's presence, like a soft shadow that never fully left her. In quiet moments, when the world around her seemed distant, she found herself thinking about the letters she had once received and the decision he had made to leave her. She always wondered what could have been, how her life might have turned out if Richard had chosen a different path. These thoughts came and went like waves, and she learned to let them pass, but the echo of her loss always lingered. Richard, on the other hand, lived with the weight of regret. He had married someone who loved him deeply, but in the depths of his heart, he knew he could never give her what he had given Elizabeth. Military life had shaped him, made him hard and disciplined, but the emptiness he felt from not having Elizabeth by his side was something that followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. With each mission, with each new post, he wondered if she still thought of him, if her heart, like his, still harbored the memory of a love that had never been forgotten. The decades moved on, and life pushed them further apart. Elizabeth raised her children, built a family, and her life became a mix of happy and melancholic moments. She loved her children and her husband, but there was something in her gaze that never fully faded, a sadness only she knew. It was the lingering trace of that first love, never fully realized. Even on days of joy, there was a corner of her heart where Richard still lived, a persistent reminder of a distant youth and a promise that had never been fulfilled. Richard, after years of service, eventually retired and returned to Germany, where he lived a solitary life, despite the family that surrounded him. His children respected him, his wife loved him, but he felt that something was missing. On sleepless nights, he would rise from bed and walk to a box of old letters, hidden in the back of a closet. There were Elizabeth's letters, yellowed with age, and when he touched them, he felt the pain of a lifetime of regret. He wondered if there was still time to fix the past. Deep down, Richard knew he had lost something irreplaceable. Life had continued as it always does, but the feelings he had nurtured for Elizabeth had never disappeared. Now, decades later, he questioned whether there was still hope, or if fate had already sealed its course irrevocably. And then one night, as he gazed at the dark sky over Munich, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He knew he couldn't go on living without knowing what had happened to Elizabeth. The early morning in Munich was cold and silent when Richard finally decided he couldn't continue living with regret. The image of Elizabeth, with her loose hair and eyes full of dreams, still haunted him. He no longer had the advantage of youth, but he had something even stronger: the need to know. He had to find out if the love he had lost could, in some way, be restored. The decision to seek her out after so many years came as both a relief and a burden. But he knew he couldn't die without seeing her again. The memories of Verona had become blurred by time, but one thing remained clear: the love he had for Elizabeth had never disappeared. Richard began gathering information about her life, hiring a private investigator, a decision that filled him with a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew Elizabeth might have moved on, built a life without him, but it didn't matter. The need to see her, to at least know how she was something he could no longer ignore. The silence of the years weighed on his shoulders like a burden he needed to relieve. The weeks that followed were filled with anticipation as Richard awaited news from the investigator. His heart raced each time the phone rang, both fearing and longing for the answer. While he waited, he found himself revisiting the old letters, now yellowed by time. The words Elizabeth had written seemed even more powerful now, after all these years. Each sentence was a reminder of all they had shared and what could have been. He felt a deep ache as he realized that, in his youth, he had let go of what mattered most. When the investigator finally called, Richard knew immediately that the answers he had been waiting for would bring more than just peace. They would bring a new reality. Elizabeth had married, had children, and lived in a small town, far from the bustle of big cities. Richard felt a mix of relief and despair upon learning she was alive and apparently well. But there was more. The investigator revealed something Richard hadn't been prepared to hear. Elizabeth was ill, suffering from a severe, irreversible disease that was slowly consuming her. The investigator's words echoed in Richard's mind like distant thunder, and for a moment, he felt the ground fall away beneath his feet. He had imagined an emotional reunion, an apology, perhaps even a chance to reconnect the ties that had been cut. But Elizabeth's illness changed everything. Now time was even more precious. The idea of seeing her again was no longer just a matter of relief for his heart, but a race against time. He needed to see her before it was too late. Determined, Richard wasted no time. He packed his bags, prepared for the journey, and booked a flight to the town where Elizabeth now lived. He knew that, no matter what he found, he had to be by her side. There was much to be said, but the words mattered less than his presence. Deep in his soul, Richard knew that this reunion would be his last chance to correct the greatest mistake of his life. As the plane took off, Richard looked out the window, feeling the weight of expectation and hope. Now more than ever, he needed to believe there was still time for love, even in the darkest of circumstances. The journey was quiet, but inside Richard, a storm of emotions brewed. The plane seemed to glide over clouds laden with uncertainties as he prepared to reunite with Elizabeth after 4 decades of silence. When he finally landed, The weight of reality bore down on him like never before. He didn't know what to expect. Would she remember him? Or would he be just a face from the past, lost among the scars of time? Doubts gnawed at his thoughts, but the one certainty he had was that he needed to see her, no matter the cost. When Richard arrived in the small town where Elizabeth lived, the air felt heavier. The quiet, peaceful streets contrasted with the turmoil he felt inside. The address the investigator had given him seemed like a sanctuary, a portal to the past he so desperately wanted to revisit. When he reached Elizabeth's front door, his hands trembled. For a moment, fear paralyzed him. What if she didn't want to see him? What if her illness had changed her so much that he barely recognized her? Even so, with a deep breath, he knocked on the door. When the door finally opened, Richard could hardly believe what he saw. Elizabeth stood there, in front of him, frilier than he remembered, but still with the same eyes that had captivated him in Verona. There was something in her gaze that struck him deeply, a mix of surprise and recognition, as if time had frozen for just a moment. She looked at him in silence as though seeing a ghost, a reflection of a life she had left behind. The world around them seemed to disappear as they stared at each other, absorbing the magnitude of this reunion. Despite her physical frailty, Elizabeth appeared serene. Her hair, now gray, still shone under the evening light, and her eyes, though tired, still held a spark of life. She said nothing, but her gaze was filled with unspoken meanings. Richard saw in her a woman who had lived, suffered, and loved. A woman who, despite everything, carried the burden of a love that had never faded. Feeling the weight of the decades that separated them, Richard reached out, hesitantly, and as he touched her, the invisible barrier between them seemed to dissolve. Time had been cruel, and the illness had stolen Elizabeth's vigor, but in that moment everything felt aligned. The years of separation, the interrupted letters, the unshed tears, all culminated in that silent touch. For the first time in years, Richard felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. Elizabeth, still in silence, guided him inside, where the ghosts of their past waited to be exorcised. They didn't need words. The emotion between them spoke louder than anything. Seated across from each other, memories floated around them like leaves carried by the wind. Richard realized that, despite all the time they had lost, the love between them had never truly died. It had been lying dormant, waiting to be awakened, even if it was now too late. Elizabeth, with a sad smile, seemed to understand this better than he did. The reunion was marked by a mixture of joy and pain. There was so much to say, so much to explain, but words were not enough to capture the depth of what they felt. Love, though wounded, still pulsed between them. In the days following the reunion, Richard found himself swept up in a whirlwind of emotions and challenges he hadn't been prepared to face. The time they had together was short, and the gravity of Elizabeth's illness soon became impossible to ignore. She was much sicker than he had imagined, and the doctors were clear. There was little they could do beyond keeping her comfortable. Richard, who had spent most of his life dealing with tough situations in the army, now felt powerless in the face of Elizabeth's fragility. The weight of mortality hung over them like a dark cloud. Elizabeth, on the other hand, seemed more at peace than Richard could have imagined. There was acceptance in her eyes, a calm understanding that her life was nearing its end. She didn't show fear, but Richard could feel the quiet sadness that emanated from every gesture, every tired smile. He was desperate to do something, anything, to give her more time, but he knew the battle they were fighting was not one he could win. Elizabeth, always so calm, tried to comfort him through her own pain, but all Richard could think about was the time they had lost. Every night, Richard sat by her side, holding her hand with an almost desperate firmness. He would recount stories of the old days, of Verona, of the moments they had lived and the ones he had dreamed of living. Elizabeth listened in silence, sometimes with a smile, other times with discreet tears. She knew his words reflected the guilt he carried, but for her there were no regrets. What they had now, however brief, was all that mattered. Time finally was on their side, even if only for a fleeting moment. Elizabeth's health began to decline rapidly. Each day brought a new challenge, a new symptom that weakened her even further. Richard, watching her struggle against the pain, felt his heart break in ways he had never imagined. He spent every moment trying to be there for her, trying to ease her suffering, even if only with his presence. There was an urgency in his behavior, a need to make every second count, to ensure that Elizabeth knew he was there, that he would never leave her again, no matter what. Amidst the suffering, however, there were moments of unexpected peace. Richard and Elizabeth found a deep connection in the smallest gestures, in the looks, in the smiles, in the gentle touches that spoke more than any words could. They knew time was running out, but somehow the love they shared felt stronger than ever. It was as though, even in the midst of tragedy, there was comfort in the fact that they were together finally, after so many years apart. Richard couldn't escape the feeling that life was cruel. Just when he had finally found Elizabeth again, fate was ready to take her away. But despite the pain, he refused to let despair consume him. He knew somehow that the time they were spending together was the most precious gift they could have. Even though the end was inevitable, what mattered was the now, and he would do everything in his power to make sure Elizabeth knew that. Each day that passed was both a victory and a loss. They lived between the joy of being together and the looming sadness of goodbye. Richard knew that in the end, love was all they had. Autumn had arrived, and the golden leaves gently fell from the trees surrounding the small house where Elizabeth and Richard now spent their days. Elizabeth's frailty was more apparent with each passing day, and every movement seemed to require an immense effort from her. Yet there was something she wanted to do before her time ran out. One day, while Richard helped her walk to the porch, she looked into his eyes, and with the serenity of someone who had accepted their fate, she suggested they get married again. Richard, caught off guard, felt a wave of emotion flood his chest. Elizabeth's request wasn't dramatic, but it carried the weight of a life not fully lived together. She knew their time was short, but in some way she wanted to seal this reunion with a renewed promise. Richard, his eyes filled with tears, silently nodded. He understood that despite all they had lost, this ceremony would be a way to reaffirm the love that had always been there, quietly waiting for its moment to be celebrated again. The idea of marrying her once more, even in such painful circumstances, brought them an unexpected joy. The wedding would be something simple, intimate, just for the two of them. There would be no grand party, no guests, only the purity of the moment and the promise they had once made, now renewed with the weight of years of longing. Richard began organizing the details, driven by a mix of sadness and devotion. He wanted everything to be perfect, for Elizabeth to feel how deeply he still loved her, even after all the decades of separation. Every detail, from the flowers to the setting of the ceremony, was chosen with his heart. On the appointed day, the sun was low on the horizon, and the golden light of the evening illuminated the small garden where the ceremony would take place. Elizabeth sat in a chair, dressed in a simple white gown that, despite its simplicity, made her look like a radiant bride. Richard, wearing a suit, watched her with a tightness in his chest. It was a moment where beauty and pain intertwined, a final gesture of true love before time would inevitably separate them again. He knelt beside her, holding her hand with tenderness, feeling each fragile beat of her heart. With few words, they renewed their vows. There was no need for a priest or witnesses. The love between them was enough. Richard, with tears in his eyes, promised to care for her, to love her until the very last moment, as he always should have. Elizabeth, with a soft smile, squeezed his hand with surprising strength. She knew the end was near, but in that moment she felt complete. They had found each other again, and although time had been cruel, they had overcome the distance that had separated them for so long. When the sun finally set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard and Elizabeth sat in silence, absorbing the depth of what they had just done. There was no sadness in their eyes, only a calm acceptance. The love they felt was no less real because of the time they had lost. In fact, it was stronger. They had the present, and that was all that mattered. That night, as Elizabeth slept peacefully, Richard sat by her side, watching her with a mixture of joy and sadness. He knew their time together was running out, but he also knew he had fulfilled his promise. Their love at last was complete. In the days following the renewal of their vows, every moment by Elizabeth's side became a priceless gift for Richard. He watched her closely, recording every gesture, every glance, as if trying to eternalize them in his memory. He knew time was against them, but he refused to succumb to sadness. Each morning was a new chance to love, to be present, to cherish the small moments that, in the past, might have gone unnoticed. Elizabeth, though visibly weaker, radiated a serene peace. The certainty that they were together, despite everything, brought her comfort. Richard made sure to make Elizabeth's days special, even in the smallest of ways. He would take her to the garden, where they would sit side by side in silence, watching the leaves gently fall. The world around them seemed to slow down, as if in some way time respected the urgency of their hearts. Elizabeth, resting her head on Richard's shoulder, felt at home. He was indeed her home, the only place she had always wanted to be. Despite the physical pain she faced, she found solace in the simple fact that she was no longer alone. Every gesture of Richard's, no matter how small, was filled with a deep, quiet love. He helped her walk, made her favorite tea, and covered her with blankets when the afternoon chills set in. These were small acts, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken feelings. Elizabeth, in turn, responded with a soft smile, a look that spoke more than words could. They both knew the end was approaching, but they refused to let the sadness consume them. They lived in the present as if each day was an eternity. One day at sunset, Richard decided to do something special. He prepared a simple picnic in the garden with the foods Elizabeth had always loved. With difficulty, she joined him, laughing quietly at his attempt to create a fancy presentation. That moment, trivial as it might seem, was precious to them both. As they ate amidst the soft sounds of the breeze, Elizabeth looked at Richard with an intensity he hadn't seen in years. She was grateful, not for the picnic, but for him coming back, for being there now at the moment she needed him most. The remaining days were marked by this simplicity. There were no grand gestures, just the love between them manifesting in the most intimate and sincere moments. Richard spent hours by Elizabeth's side, holding her hand, talking about the past, about what could have been, but more importantly, about what was now. They laughed, they cried, and in silence, they accepted what fate had in store for them. Their love finally had found its fullness, even amidst the fragility of life. Each sunset, Elizabeth and Richard watched together, knowing that darkness would soon fall, but without fear. There was peace between them, a tranquility that only true love can bring. Richard knew he would lose Elizabeth soon, but he also knew he would never truly lose her. Their love, strengthened by pain and reunion, was eternal. And so, by living each moment intensely, Richard and Elizabeth found in the present what the past had denied them: the certainty that love, even when interrupted by time, always finds a way to survive. The morning arrived quietly, the sky tinged with a soft shade of blue, and the flowers in the garden swayed gently in the breeze. Richard woke and, as he did every morning, turned to look at Elizabeth. But this time something was different. Her face, once marked by pain, now displayed a serene expression, as if she had finally found peace with what was to come. In that instant, Richard knew the moment had arrived. His heart tightened with a mix of sorrow and acceptance, realizing that the love they had shared had finally reached its final destination. He took her hand, feeling the softness of her skin for the last time. Elizabeth was still breathing, but each breath seemed lighter, more distant. Richard watched her with a silent ache in his chest, but at the same time a deep gratitude. She had been his first and truest love, and now in her final moments, he was there as he had promised. Even though the pain of impending loss enveloped him, there was comfort in knowing that she would not leave this world alone, that he was there to hold her until the very end. Slowly, Elizabeth opened her eyes, and a gentle smile appeared on her lips when she saw Richard. Her eyes, though tired, still held the love they had always shared. She didn't speak. Words were no longer necessary. There was a mutual understanding between them, a quiet acceptance that their time together was coming to an end, but that the love they had shared would never die. Richard wiped away the tears that began to fall from his eyes, feeling a lump in his throat, but he remained steadfast by her side. The soft morning light bathed the two of them, and Richard felt as if time had stopped for just a brief moment, allowing them to savor these final seconds without hurry. He knew this was their final goodbye, but in some way, he also knew that the connection between them would not be broken by death. Life had been cruel in separating them for so many years, but now in Elizabeth's final moments, there was a quiet beauty in the fact that they were, at last, together. Their love had endured in ways he never could have imagined. When Elizabeth took her final breath, Richard felt his heart shatter. But along with the pain, he also felt an unexpected peace, the certainty that even in death, she wasn't truly leaving. He held her hand until the very end, whispering a final promise, the same one he had made years ago, that he would never forget her, and he knew that promise would be fulfilled. Elizabeth, his first love, would live on forever in his memory, in every part of his soul. Their love, strong and resilient, had left a legacy that time could never erase. In the days that followed, Richard arranged a simple ceremony for Elizabeth, an intimate and meaningful farewell. There was no sadness among those who knew her, only a profound respect for the love she and Richard had shared. Those who attended knew that what they had was rare, almost mythical, something everyone wished for but few ever found. And so, with a heart both heavy and grateful, Richard continued his life, carrying with him the legacy of Elizabeth and the love that had survived time, distance, and ultimately death. Their love was eternal. The story of Elizabeth and Richard is a deep and emotional portrayal of the power of true love. Even after decades of separation, the feelings that united them never faded. Their reunion teaches us that time, no matter how relentless, cannot destroy what is genuine. Elizabeth and Richard found comfort, redemption, and the renewal of their promises, proving that amidst pain and loss, love can bloom and bring peace. Their farewell was not the end, but rather a tribute to the life they dreamed of and the love that always existed. This kind of story makes us reflect on the connections we have in life and inspires us to cherish every moment with those we love. Love, even when interrupted, can be reborn with even greater strength. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to stay updated, and share this video with those you love. Let's spread more love stories and inspiration.